Hey girlies, it's Cassidy here, and I'm going to start out this episode by painting you a very clear picture. About a decade ago, I was 22 years old, and I was in what I would call the most frugal era of my life. I had just paid off all of my debt, and I was living life high on the minimalistic lifestyle. I had read Marie Kondo. I was trying to rid myself of everything that didn't bring joy. I was still following Dave Ramsey's baby steps, and I was trying not to step foot in a restaurant or do anything that cost money until I had saved and invested as much money as possible, and I was wrecked with guilt. I was cutting my own hair. I was trying to train my hair to not need shampoo. I was trying to do as many things possible to not spend money at all whatsoever. And I did that for many years. And if you fast forward out a decade, I have gotten a lot looser in terms of my purse strings and what I allow into my life. And this prompted the idea for Emily and I to do a little episode on 10 money rules we don't follow anymore. And boy, do we have them lined up for you. This is going to be a really good episode, so we're just going to go ahead and hop on in.
Welcome to The Finance Girlies, a podcast for millennial and Gen Z women who are curious about money but have never quite felt at home in traditional finance spaces.
We're Emily Batdorf and Cassidy Horton, podcast hosts, longtime friends, and finance writers for brands like AOL and Yahoo Finance.
Rather than giving you prescriptive advice, we talk about money the way friends actually do, with stories, questions, and a lot of figuring it out in real time.
So the very first money rule that we don't follow anymore is the rule that you should never, ever, ever in your life take on debt. And I think that I grew up believing this rule for two reasons. Number one, I grew up in the evangelical Christian South, where I think it's just like very common in Christian culture to be like, you don't need to be indebted to anyone. I believe that's in the Bible somewhere. So like that was ingrained in me from a child. And then also, like I said, in college, I was following Dave Ramsey's baby steps because he was kind of my entryway into personal finance at the time. And he is very anti all debt whatsoever. And so early 20s Cassidy, she was like, well, I'm never going to have debt. I don't need it. And what I have learned over the past decade is that not all debt is bad debt. In fact, we have several episodes on this. I currently have a car loan and my interest rate is less than 3%. And I feel really good. I had enough money to pay for that car in full if I wanted to, but the interest rate was so low that I opted to take on the debt and have the car payment instead, because when it's all said and done, I will have paid a little over $1,000 in interest. And that feels like a good trade-off to me to still have that cash in my emergency fund, for example. And I also think that we are just living in a time where everything costs so much money, and I feel like it's nearly impossible to skate by your entire adult life without having to take on some form of debt at some point. And I don't think that that's necessarily like a character flaw if you end up with debt at some point. I think it's just kind of the nature of living in the society that we live in. But you can still be smart about it, of course.
So another rule that we used to hear all the time when we were just getting started in the personal finance space was to not use credit cards. And this is something, even to this day, like I still hear this advice from some people, and I have heard of plenty of people who don't use credit cards. I personally never subscribed to this rule, but I do think just like hearing this advice gave me a little bit of fear and anxiety around credit cards, which caused me to keep putting off opening my first credit card. And so I didn't open my first credit card until like, it was probably 23 or 24, which is still very young, but I wished at the time I had opened one earlier. Today, I use a credit card for pretty much every purpose. I think I only use my debit card to like get cash from an ATM, or if like there's a big fee for using a credit card, and I treat it like a debit card, so I pay it off every single month in full. But using a credit card has so many perks that you don't get with a debit card. For example, earning points and cash back, and credit cards have much better purchase protection than debit cards. So I am a big fan of credit cards, and I think if you can use them responsibly and are able to pay them back in full every single month, then this rule is a little outdated.
Yeah, I think a lot of well-intentioned people, in my case, it was like adults when I was a teenager, they were warning me, like, never get a credit card. Credit cards are really bad. And I think that was coming from people who had credit card debt and could like feel the effects of what those minimum payments and compounding interest was doing to just their like stress levels and overall financial security. But I do remember, like, even by the time that I heard that advice as a teenager, I already knew that, like, credit cards were perfectly okay as long as you paid the balance off in full every month. Like, you wouldn't pay any interest. You would just get to reap whatever rewards your particular card had. And so I was skeptical of this advice from the beginning, but I think that's only because I understood that if you just paid it off in full every month, you would be okay. And same as you, Emily, I use my credit card for literally everything other than withdrawing cash from an ATM. Love my credit cards. The third money rule we don't follow anymore is the rule that you need to pay off all debt before you ever start investing. And I kind of alluded to this in the beginning. I was someone who like held off investing for years because I was afraid, and my like procrastination task while I was so afraid was just to be like, I'm going to pay off 100% of my debt, even the car loan that I had at the time that also had a very low interest rate. But the truth is, if you have low interest debt, and let's say that your interest rate is like anything below 6, 7, or 8%, like you could be better off continuing to make whatever payments you need to make on that debt and then using whatever extra money you have to invest versus using all of your extra money to pay off that low interest debt. And I think just as a tangible example, I'm pulling these numbers straight out of my head, but just to illustrate this, it's like, say you have $10,000 and you have two options. You could either use that $10,000 to pay off your car loan that has like a 3% interest rate, or you could invest that money in the stock market and just say like your long-term average return is like 7%, right? That would be 4 extra percent you could earn by investing that money than you would save by paying off the car loan, which could equate to like thousands of extra dollars you could have in the long run if you just invested that money instead. So that's what we mean whenever we say like you have the potential of earning more than you would potentially save in interest by paying it off.
Yeah, that's helpful. And also, if you think about like how, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, when you're investing, the more time you have, the better. So if you're pushing off starting investing because you want to pay off all your debt first and you're pushing that like years and years down the line, then you are going to miss out on a lot of years of compound interest.
Yes, for sure. Also, in that same vein, a lot of traditional financial experts out there will say, like, you should not step foot in a restaurant if you still have debt. Like, you should deny yourself pretty much everything in life that brings you joy in pursuit of paying off that debt as soon as you can. And that can work for a short period of time, and some people may feel motivated by that. But I also think that you should be allowed to spend money on little things that bring you joy, like while you're around to experience those things. Like we're not guaranteed tomorrow. And yes, it's good to be financially wise with your money. And yes, it's good to prioritize paying off your debt. But I also don't think that it is as like all or nothing as it is sometimes portrayed to be. I think that there is a lot of gray area where you can still, set aside money for the experiences that you're going to think back on when you're in your 80s, or to like do something that's going to be really great for your mental health, or to do something that aligns with one of your values, like, taking a workshop to help build your community or to develop a skill that you love, or whatever. Like there is a lot of gray area in there. And I think traditional financial advice leads you to believe that if you are paying off debt, you have to deny yourself of 100% of everything else until that's done. And I do think that being wise with the dollars you have is good. And also I think that you can do both very thoughtfully.
Yeah. I agree. Rule number 4 is to avoid lifestyle creep. And while I still subscribe to this rule to some degree, I think I've like loosened my grip on it a little bit as well. And so if you're not familiar with the term lifestyle creep, essentially that means that as you earn more money, you tend to want to spend more money by upgrading different areas of your life. So maybe you move to a nicer apartment or get a nicer car or buy organic groceries or whatever it is. And a lot of like common financial advice says instead of upgrading your life, use that extra money to pay off debt, put towards savings, invest. And I think this overlaps a little bit with like the philosophy of the FIRE movement, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But my take, and this has evolved, I think, over the years, is that to some degree, the bigger the gap between your expenses and your income, yes, the more you should save and invest if that is important to you. However, I don't want to live how I lived in my early 20s as a 31-year-old, you know? I just think to some degree this advice is a little bit unrealistic. Like, I'm past the point in my life where I want 5 roommates. You know what I mean?
I think to a degree we all have to experience some lifestyle creep.
Mm-hmm.
But the key is to do it very thoughtfully in a way that really aligns to you, you know? I think actually the advice that's underneath this to like avoid lifestyle creep is to like avoid trying to keep up with the Joneses for the sake of keeping up with the Joneses, you know? Like, I am definitely living a more quote unquote luxurious lifestyle than I did in my early 20s, but I am still like every single decision I have tried to make in terms of what city am I going to live in, even if that city's more expensive? What apartment am I going to live in, even if that apartment's more expensive? What car am I going to drive, even if driving this car is more expensive than like buying one that's 10 years old already and costs just like a few $1,000s, is I'm trying to be very thoughtful about like the quality of life upgrade that will come with each of those choices versus just living in a real big fancy apartment for the sake of living in a real big fancy apartment, right? Like, I still feel like I'm limiting myself to the space that I feel like I need. So just trying to find a balance where you're like really thoughtful about both of those sides of the equation, I think is key.
Yeah. That's a good caveat, because I think the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, as you said, I think that is entirely based on like other people's perceptions of you or how you want to be perceived. And I think that can be a harmful way to live. And so I think that advice to kind of like ignore as much as you can what other people think about you or to avoid spending to make a certain impression on people, I think that is generally good advice.
Yeah. I think I always try to ask myself, like, if no one ever knew about this thing, like if no one ever found out what apartment I live in or like what type of car that I drive or what I eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like, would I still want to do that because it felt very in alignment with what I wanted as a person? And I think if the answer is yes, then that could be a signal to like go ahead and do that thing. But if I don't know, if you're like, well, I don't like, maybe I don't care about like this designer thing or this really fancy thing, if no one actually ever knew about it, then maybe that could be your like internal compass for maybe that's a form of lifestyle creep you don't need. So
yeah.
All right. I feel like you are going to have a lot of thoughts on these next couple of ones, but do you want to talk about the 5th money rule we don't follow anymore, which is you should buy a house as soon as you can?
Yes. And I feel like I have a complicated relationship with this topic because I think, like most people, I like grew up thinking that I would buy a house at like maybe a similar age to when my parents did, which is like relatively young now that I think about it. And it wasn't until I guess started working, and then I feel like it's become so much of a conversation among younger personal finance experts these days of like, you don't need to buy a house. And that is like such a general piece of advice that has been passed along by older generations. I think people used to view homes as like really solid investments. And now with access to the stock market, like there are other ways for people to build wealth and a lot of times like better ways for people to build wealth. And so I think in my late 20s, I came to the conclusion of prioritizing buying a house is not like the best financial move. And so I kind of changed my mind on that. And I since then have changed my mind in the sense of like what I want, realizing that actually I do want a house, but the way I feel about this advice hasn't changed. I still believe that you shouldn't feel rushed or pressured to buy a house just because it's like the thing to do, kind of going back to what we were talking about, keeping up with the Joneses. And I guess even in my personal experience, like outside of the financial implications of buying a house before you really want to, if I had tried to buy a house when I was in my early 20s, first of all, I wouldn't have been able to. But 2, like, I didn't know where I wanted to live. I feel like that is such a big decision if you are someone who has the freedom to work anywhere or cares deeply about, like, choosing the place you want to live. And so it wasn't until, like, literally last year where I was like, I can actually see myself in a place for decades. So I know you have similar thoughts about this.
Yes, I am 32 years old and have never owned a home, and don't know that I have plans to necessarily anytime soon. And I think that this was well-intentioned advice way back in the day, but I think for me, I've always preferred renting because I've moved around a lot, grew up in Georgia, lived in Washington State, now live in Minnesota. And also all of the examples that I had growing up of family members who bought houses, literally every single one, I can think of at least 5 experiences where they eventually got to the point where they were ready to sell their home and it was on the market forever and they ended up losing money when it was all said and done. And it just seemed like such a trap in a way. And like I said, in all of these instances, which most of these instances are in like the rural South, but they weren't making tons of money, Like I think you hear of it being a good investment and you're like, oh, I'm gonna make so much money back if I ever go to sell this thing. And those were not the examples that I had in my life growing up. So I think even from a very young age, I was like, you know what? I feel perfectly fine with renting. I don't feel like it's throwing my money away. I feel like it gives me a lot of freedom to live the life that I want to live, and that is okay with me.
Yeah.
So
I think that's where a lot of our generation has kind of like come to that conclusion, and I think it's good for a lot of people.
Yeah. In that same vein, though, another money rule that I know, like there was a period, for example, in my life a few years ago where I was thinking maybe I do want to buy a house. So I was starting to look at it more seriously. And I went into this thought process thinking, okay, if I buy a house, I absolutely have to put 20% down. I feel like that's the golden rule that you hear always. But I think another money rule that we're not following is that you have to put 20% down on a house. And as someone who has kind of started the home buying journey, can you speak to like how that weighed into your decision of being like, maybe this isn't something we need to do?
Yes. So, and I say all of this with the caveat of like, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend this approach, or like, I think saving 20% for a down payment is wonderful, but I will share like my thought process. So up until like a year ago, truly, my husband and I thought we would rent for like the next 5 years at least. And a year ago, we kind of came to this point where we were like, we're not actually super happy with where we're living. We need a change. And we moved to a different rental in a different town and absolutely loved it from the start. And it was only then where we kind of had this realization of like, oh, the reason that we thought we'd just keep renting was because we couldn't actually see like a long-term commitment to where we were living. And actually we do want to buy a house, and we do want to buy a house in this area that we love. And so because of that, we had not been saving for a house. We thought like it was way down the road. We might have been saving a little bit, but not much at all. It was like a very down the line goal. And also the place we're renting, we've loved it, and it was like definitely the right move, but it feels like it's like we're paying too much to where we could be in a house of our own for around the same amount of money and get so much more for our money. And so we also live in a pretty hot market that is growing really, really fast. And so all of these different circumstances kind of led us to say, let's start the home buying process. Let's be willing to buy with less than 20% down while keeping savings, because we know emergencies will happen and we want to be ready for that. We're comfortable. We're setting our price point at a place we feel is reasonable. And we're okay taking on that extra private mortgage insurance, which is what you do when you put down less than 20%. You pay it up until you hit that 20% equity mark. And those were just kind of the trade-offs that we weighed and how we came to that decision. I also will say, I think our conversation that we had with our friend Hillary, and this was in, I think, our first paid episode ever, she had mentioned she had kind of a similar story actually in buying her first home, and she kind of just like normalized it for me. I think that's honestly part of it. So that's the long answer.
I've never gone through the home buying process, but I feel like whenever you think of buying a home, you're like, oh, if I can't put 20% down, then I guess I'm not ready to buy a home. But research actually shows that the average down payment is like 9 to 10%. So I feel like more people are putting down less on a home than you probably think is happening, but that can also help normalize it as well.
Yeah. I also will say, and I think this maybe was another like mindset shift. We live in a very rural area, and so a lot of like people we know have done USDA loans, which are like rural development loans, and they have 0% down payment. And so I think And we talked to a lot of lenders about like, would that work for us? And it ended up not. But yeah, so I don't know. I think we didn't go into it thinking like, how can we put 0% down? But talking to people who've done those types of loans and stuff, it just kind of like got into our head that like, people do this. All right. Next rule number 7, don't touch your emergency fund.
This one hits hard. And I think that's because it's really easy to talk yourself out of what's an emergency and what's not. I feel like no matter what's happening, you can be like, but is this actually an emergency? Like, is this actually worth me dipping into this money for? And also, I spent so long to build it up and I don't want to touch it. It's like this prize that you put on a shelf and you're like, my emergency fund's up there. I better not ever touch it. So this required some mindset work for me to let go of. And I think what I've come to realize is that whenever you build an emergency fund, it's not a trophy that you put on a shelf, but it is like a fire extinguisher behind glass. And sometimes you need to break the glass and grab the fire extinguisher to put out the fire, and that is okay. And I also think that it's really easy to feel defeated and like you've done something wrong if you need to use your emergency fund for something. But I think the truth of the matter is like that emergency probably would have happened regardless of how much money you have in the bank. And the fact that you are able to use your emergency fund to deal with that emergency versus having to take on debt or be really stressed about how you're going to cover it in other ways. I think that's proof to like the emergency fund is doing its purpose. It is doing the thing it's intended to do. And so it's actually really good.
Yeah. I will say the thing that I think convinced me or drove me to like using my emergency fund was getting a puppy and having those unexpected emergency vet bills. That did it. And the cracked tooth, the tooth extraction.
For sure.
So,
I think another thing for me, I have a high deductible health insurance plan, and I will caveat this by saying I have used some of my emergency fund to pay for medical bills, like to help myself meet my deductible for my health insurance plan. And I think in those situations, it would have been really easy for me to say, do you really need to go to the doctor that bad? I mean, this thing that you're experiencing isn't that big of a deal. You should have been wise enough in the beginning to set aside like a separate pot of money for like medical bills specifically, because everyone's got to go to the doctor at some point, and is this really an emergency kind of thing? But I do think another reason to have an emergency fund, especially if you have like a high deductible healthcare plan where it feels like you're essentially paying for everything out of pocket until you meet your deductible, is I'm like, my emergency fund is there to help me meet my deductible if I have a medical bill that feels large, you know? And so I've also done some mindset shifting around that too.
Yeah. In this country, going to the doctor feels like an emergency. Like, even if it's not. It's like the stress of like, what is my bill going to be, you know?
Yeah. I feel like I've also found myself too many times in my adult life being like, am I really sick enough to go to the doctor? Like, I remember a few years ago, I seriously thought that I broke my rib. And I don't know if you remember this. I thought that I broke my rib, and I tried to deal with it for just 2 weeks, and it was not feeling any better. And so finally I got to the point, and I was trying to deal with it because I didn't want to pay to go to the doctor. And I finally got to the point where I was like, I'm going to go to the doctor. But there was another part of me in the back of my head that was like, if I go to the doctor and my rib is not actually broken, I'm going to be ticked off that I spent this money to get an x-ray when I could have just like continued to be fine. And then I laughed when I had that thought, because I'm like, no, the best case scenario is your rib is not broken. Like, that is the news that we want to get.
My rib better be broken.
I know, but I was like, if I'm going to pay for this x-ray, it better be worth it. This rib better be messed up. But then I'm like, no, that's such a silly way to think about it. So
yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we did an episode on this topic too called Rethinking the Emergency Fund, and it's episode number 70. And we kind of go into this rule as like, what is an emergency fund really for? So
yeah.
Interesting listen if you haven't heard. Okay, number 8, and you have experience with this, I don't. So tell us about the FIRE movement and what rules it entails and why you don't follow them anymore.
Yeah, so I think when I was a young adult, in my early 20s, going back to this really frugal stage where I was, feeling a lot of stress about spending any money that I didn't absolutely need to spend, I was allured into thinking that like maybe I wanted to chase FIRE, which for those of you who don't know, FIRE is the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. And the idea is, and this part is actually true, like retirement is not an age, retirement is just a number. Like once you have enough money in the bank in investments, like your net worth is a certain amount, you can theoretically retire at any age. So the quicker you get to that number, the quicker you can retire. And that's how people end up retiring in their like 30s and 40s or whatever. And so this really appealed to me. And I think it appealed to me because whenever you're in your early 20s and you look out at the horizon of how long a typical career is, you're like, I don't want to be working for 30 or 40 years. That feels like freaking forever. And so I was like, I'm going to chase FIRE. Like maybe I'll be able to retire in my 30s. And newsflash, now that I'm in my 30s, I'm like, that time actually went by very quickly. I think this is fine. But I feel like one big cornerstone of the FIRE movement, this is like a superpower fatal flaw. Like it is both good and bad, but it is that truly the least amount of money that you need to live on, the more money you will have to save and invest, and the less money you will need overall to retire. Because if you're living on $30,000 a year, theoretically, you can save up a lot less money and retire a lot faster than someone who needs $60,000 to live off or $100,000 to live off of every year. And so like that math is well intentioned. And also I think that it can kind of have this negative effect where you feel racked with guilt for spending any money on anything, because that means that you're inflating the amount of money that you need every year to live on, which means you're inflating your FIRE number, like the number that you need to hit before you can retire. And so anyway, I think that had to do with a lot of my frugality and the stress that I felt early on in my 20s. And then once I kind of let go of that, I was able to allow myself to spend more money on normal things and things that actually made me happy and experiences and things that brought me joy. But I also think another part of the FIRE movement that made me think, okay, like maybe I don't want to chase this as aggressively as I once did, is just the fact that like none of us are guaranteed to live until our 50s or our late 40s or our 60s or our 70s or however long. And so I also didn't like the idea of denying myself of everything that brought me joy for the next 15 or 20 years, just on the off chance that, God forbid something happens and I don't get to experience it. So I don't know. I think it just really made me change my mind and want to strike a balance between like enjoying my life now while I'm healthy and while I know that I have this life, and also be really smart about saving for my future. But once again, like not thinking of it so much as an either or, like I can either spend my money recklessly or I don't spend any money whatsoever, and realizing that there is a ton of gray area in between that. And I can still be really smart about my future and also still have experiences, spend money on things that align with my values, be frivolous in the ways that feel very in alignment with me. And that's okay.
Yeah. Well said. I think either extreme can be so dangerous for so many reasons.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think the key is in that gray area for sure.
And I think for whatever reason, I don't know where this comes from, but like for most of my life have thought in kind of like either you do this at all or you don't do it at all, and it has been very freeing to realize. Like another example that I'll give, and this is just off the cuff, is like I didn't get my first tattoo until I was 28. And you think, like, whenever you don't have any tattoos, at least this was my experience, you think, if I get a tattoo, I'm just going to be a tattoo person and I'll have zero self-control and my whole body will just be covered in tattoos. And then, I don't know, it's like that keeps you from wanting one at all. But, then you get one and you're like, I forget that this is on my body most of the time and I don't identify as someone, like, I don't believe in my core that I'm a person with tattoos. Like, I still am who I am. So, you're like, I am Cassidy and I just so happen to have a tattoo. So it's, yeah, it's just little things like that where, I don't know.
That's a really funny example.
Yeah.
When will she get sleeves?
Ooh, I am up to 1, 2, 3, 4 tattoos, so we'll see. I don't think a sleeve is in my future, but I know. I know.
Okay, rule number 9. The best choice is the financially optimized one. And this one is really tough to let go of, but I feel like I have had certain situations or certain contexts where I've recognized this lately. The most obvious, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, is like with the home buying thing. Like deciding buying a home is not the best financial move, but it is, I think, the best choice for me. But that took years of just thinking otherwise, you know? It's really hard when you work so hard to build good financial habits and like work up to these milestones. It's not true that you are, but it feels like you're kind of backtracking. Like it just feels wrong and it's really hard. And I think maybe that is like some perfectionist tendencies or like maybe that's, I don't know. I guess I don't really think it's like a specific to women because I know men can kind of lead with numbers instead of emotions, maybe even more so. So I don't know, but I think this one is a tough one.
It felt like a light bulb moment for me to realize, like, oh, if I ever did get to the point where I wanted to buy a house, like that could just be a choice that felt very in alignment with me as a person, even if it wasn't the choice that makes the most financial sense, because I do think a lot of times we do associate buying a house specifically with being the more financially wise decision. But at the end of the day, you could just want a house that is physically yours for lots of other reasons. So that's really important to keep in mind. I also think it's kind of, this is a very small example, but like whenever it comes to eating food, for example, the financially optimized choice almost always would be to eat rice and beans at home, you know? But it's like we don't do that. At least in my case, we've talked about this before. I view dining out at a local restaurant, especially with friends, as like an experience. Like I want to support that business. I want to enjoy that food. I know that it costs more money, but I love it and it brings me joy. And so I think sometimes we forget that that can also apply to other areas in our life too. And once again, like we will always caveat this by saying you still need to be financially wise, right? Like you don't need to go and buy a house that's going to make you house poor or like have a massive payment that feels, you know, like a heavy weight laying on your chest whenever you have to pay it every month. But like you can make a choice that's not maybe necessarily financially optimized and it still be a choice that's well worth your money. I also think back to people who choose to like hire someone to clean their homes like once a month or once every other week. The choice, the more financially optimized choice is always going to be clean your house yourself, wash your car yourself, mow your grass yourself. Like, but sometimes you feel like that money is well worth it and that is money well spent for various reasons. And so you can't always just think of it as this like numerical, what makes the most financial sense. Sometimes the right choice for you may not be the one that makes the most financial sense, but it's still the right decision for you. And that's what's important.
Yeah. I feel like one super obvious example of this, and I don't know, maybe this is like oversimplifying it, but like having kids. Like,
yeah, totally.
Not a good financial choice on paper. Yes. But so many people do it and they do it for other reasons. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
Totally. Yeah. I just think our society has labeled certain purchases in particular as like, you can only do this one thing if it's financially optimized. And maybe that was the case back in the day. You know, housing was so much cheaper. A lot of times buying a house was the more financially optimized choice than renting. But that doesn't, I don't think that advice holds as true to such a large degree today.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
So, all right. The very last money rule we don't follow anymore, and it's kind of funny, is the rule that you shouldn't talk about money with anyone, that your financial life is yours and zip it and keep it shut and keep it to yourself.
Oops.
Yeah.
Oops, we have a podcast about money. No, with this one, it's nice to see that people are more open about talking about money. I mean, the reason we do this podcast is because we want more women like us and people in our generations to feel comfortable with money and feel like they can get the answers they need and know that they're not alone with their money struggles. And not talking about money just makes all of that worse. And that is like the opposite of what we stand for. And I think there are degrees of talking about money. We're not saying you need to go out and tell your whole family your salary down to the penny or anything like that, but just being open about different parts of your financial life and like sharing your experiences, I guess, really.
I do think it's very important to have people in your life that you feel safe enough around to discuss like money questions that you have with or like whatever financial goals you're working toward, because chances are they could be wanting to work toward those same goals. They could have those same financial questions, but they also don't know that, you know, so then all of a sudden it's like something you can talk about together. And I also feel especially like because you and I are both freelancers too, that this is kind of a different caveat, but in terms of like what to charge clients and how to run a freelance business, like if I didn't have other freelancers that were willing to talk about the financials of what it's like to be a freelancer, I don't feel like my business would be nearly what it is today if I didn't have other people to talk about that stuff with. And I think our personal financial lives can be the same way in a lot of ways. You know, like you need people that you can go to, even if it's just to talk something out with. You know, it's so helpful to have like a sounding board in that regard.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. So we look back on a lot of these money rules that we used to follow and laugh. But we also want to recognize that certain rules can serve you at different points in your life. So like, for example, Cassidy, your minimalist phase served you for a period of time. And it's okay for those rules to change. So like, if you do subscribe to some of these rules right now, that's okay. We're not like judging you, but we just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, it's good to like reassess where you're at and why you're subscribing to these rules and whether or not they're still serving you. Also, if you have any money rules that you aren't following anymore, we would love to hear them. So email us at hello@thefinancegirlies.com.
Love ya. Bye.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Finance Girlies podcast. Nothing in this episode is meant to be taken as financial advice.
Please do your own research and talk to a professional if you need advice. If you liked this episode, consider leaving a review. Better yet, send the show to a friend who might enjoy it too. Love ya. Bye.
Nailed it.